Well, they're getting close to something, but I hope Ukraine moves quickly. I hope Ukraine moves quickly because Russia's there. And, every time they take too much time, then Russia changes their mind. 27,000 soldiers were killed last month. Think of that. What do you think of that, doctors? 27,000, it's like a half a football stadium, were killed in 1 month. And it's that way. It's anywhere between 20 and 30,000, mostly soldiers, also some people from Kiev and other places, but largely it's the soldiers. They're losing their lives. Nobody's ever said anything like it. It's the worst since World War II. And, you've heard me say I settled 8 wars, some going on for 35 years, one going on for 37, one going on for 32. And 8 wars, and I thought this would be an easier one.
You just watched that, and you need to ask yourself what it means that this is happening right now in December 2025, while the United States, Ukraine, and Europe are conducting intensive negotiations toward a peace deal with Russia, claiming they are closer to peace than they have ever been, and what it means that the man offering to broker that peace is the same man casually announcing that 27,000 soldiers died in 1 month, with the emotional weight of someone commenting on traffic conditions. You need to understand that when Trump says, "I hope Ukraine moves quickly," while Russia's there, he is not expressing concern for Ukrainian sovereignty or Ukrainian lives, but rather revealing the entire transactional sociopathic architecture of his worldview, where human beings are bargaining chips, and mass death is a negotiating inconvenience, and the party committing genocide gets to set the timeline, because might makes right in the Trumpian universe of authoritarian deal-making. This is appeasement dressed up as pragmatism, and it deserves to be named as such, because Trump has announced key concessions to Putin regarding Ukraine, while signaling he would not insist on a return to Ukraine's sovereign 2014 borders or future NATO membership, which historians and European leaders have explicitly compared to Chamberlain's Munich Agreement, where Chamberlain's goal of peace may have been honorable, but he was dangerously naive about the human nature of a tyrant, bent on territorial and maniacal ambitions, and we must grasp the absolute horror that we are watching this unfold in real time, not in some dusty history textbook, but right now as Ukraine faces Washington's pressure to swiftly accept a U.S.-brokered peace deal in the face of an increasingly assertive Moscow, while bodies pile up at rates not seen since World War II. But wait, because it gets so much worse when you actually parse what Trump is saying here, with his "I settled 8 wars" boasting, which is classic narcissistic deflection from the actual substance of what peace requires, when you're dealing with an expansionist autocrat who has repeatedly demonstrated through actions in Chechnya, in Georgia, and Syria, and now catastrophically in Ukraine, that he respects nothing but force and international resistance. Trump thought this would be an easier one, which tells you everything you need to know about his fundamental misunderstanding of what is at stake here, because this is not some real estate squabble that can be resolved with a handshake and a photo op, but rather an existential struggle over whether democracies will defend the principle of sovereignty against naked territorial aggression, or whether we will slide back into a 19th century great power paradigm where larger nations simply carve up smaller ones when convenient and realpolitik masquerades as wisdom. The chilling nonchalance with which Trump discusses these deaths, asking "What do you think of that, doctors?" as if polling random attendees about catastrophic human suffering, exposes the void where empathy and moral seriousness should reside in a leader tasked with defending democratic values against autocratic violence. You have to recognize that Trump's grandiose initial 28-point peace plan was modified after European leaders called it a capitulation to Russian demands, which included Moscow keeping captured Ukrainian territories and plans for Ukraine to cede the eastern Donbas region entirely, cut its military might, and completely abandon any plans of joining NATO, and even with modification. But reporting suggests the key points include a renewed U.S. proposal for Ukraine to cede strategic regions in western Donbas that Russia has been unable to conquer, which was widely criticized in the United States, including by Republicans in Congress, as dangerously favorable to the Kremlin, because this is what appeasement looks like in 2025, rewarding aggression with territorial gains, and demanding that the victim of invasion surrender defensible positions while the aggressor consolidates control and plans the next phase of expansion, because there is no indication that Putin has given up his objective to achieve effective political control of Ukraine, which would require Russia to take far more Ukrainian territory. And this is the man Trump wants to hand a victory to, while pretending it represents peace. The numbers Trump cites deserve scrutiny, because while 427,000 Russian casualties, with more than half occurring in 2024 alone, with troop losses reaching record levels in November and December, demonstrates the unsustainable brutality of Putin's war machine. Trump weaponizes these casualty figures not to condemn Russian aggression, but to pressure Ukraine into capitulation, constructing a narrative where Ukrainian resistance becomes the problem rather than Russian invasion, which represents a moral inversion so complete it takes your breath away. Ukrainian President Zelensky said in December 2024 that 43,000 Ukrainian soldiers had been killed and 370,000 injured, while 908,000 Russian soldiers had been killed and 550,000 injured, casualties at rates that should terrify any rational leader into seeking genuine peace, not territorial conquest. Yet Putin continues, because he believes correctly or not, that time and Western resolve are on his side, especially when he has Trump as a willing accomplice in breaking Ukrainian European will. And here's the bombshell you need to internalize about what's happening right now in these negotiations, because the Biden administration has committed more than $65 billion in support since Russia's full-scale invasion, rallying the world to stand with the Ukrainian people, while Biden directed his administration to continue surging as much assistance to Ukraine as quickly as possible, drawing down older U.S. equipment for Ukraine, rapidly delivering it to the battlefield, with the Department of Defense in the process of delivering hundreds of thousands of artillery rounds, thousands of rockets and hundreds of armored vehicles to strengthen Ukraine's hand as it heads into winter, which created the conditions under which Ukraine could even contemplate negotiations from a position that isn't total collapse. But Trump's approach threatens to squander all of that leverage by telegraphing American abandonment and eagerness for any deal, regardless of terms, which sends precisely the wrong signal to Moscow about costs and consequences of continued aggression. The contrast could not be starker between an administration that understood supporting Ukraine serves American interests in upholding the international order, and an incoming administration that views the entire conflict as an annoying distraction from whatever corrupt bargain Trump has cooking with Putin. Listen to how Trump frames Ukrainian agency in this clip, saying, "I hope Ukraine moves quickly," as though Ukraine is the recalcitrant party holding up reasonable peace, when in fact, Ukraine has continued to reject the U.S. push for ceding territory to Russia, while Putin wants Ukraine to withdraw its forces from the part of Donetsk region still under its control, as one of the key conditions for peace, which amounts to demanding Ukraine surrender land it currently holds to an invader who has demonstrated zero commitment to honoring agreements or respecting sovereignty. The logical endpoint of Trump's pressure campaign is what Russia's ambassador in London described as not a deal, so much as Ukrainian surrender, and European leaders recognize this, which is why EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said Putin is mocking all of Trump's efforts, and after talks in Alaska, Putin has just increased his attacks while accusing the new leadership in Washington of pursuing a course of appeasement, because autocrats can smell weakness, and Trump absolutely reeks of it when it comes to Putin. This goes beyond garden variety incompetence into something more sinister when you consider that Trump's appeasement of Putin comes on the eve of the Munich Security Conference, where his emissaries will meet Western allies, and at least Chamberlain was trying to prevent a major European war, whereas Trump is acting in the middle of one those, and the historical parallel should terrify us, because Chamberlain and Daladier pursued appeasement towards Hitler, but Hitler's desire for expansion could not be curbed by the Munich Agreement of 1938, and instead of keeping the peace, Hitler unleashed World War II just a few months later. And we are watching this dynamic play out again with different actors, but identical logic, where territorial concessions to expansionist autocrats only whet their appetite for more. Trump's "Russia's there" comment functions as a kind of imperial fait accompli, accepting Russian presence as legitimate simply by virtue of military occupation, which abandons the foundational principle that borders cannot be changed by force that emerged from the ashes of 2 world wars and centuries of European bloodshed. The doctor's reference in this clip is particularly grotesque in its casual poll-taking quality, as if Trump is seeking validation for his assessment of mass casualties from random professionals in the room, rather than expressing genuine moral horror or strategic concern about the human cost of Putin's aggression. And this performance of concern without actual concern pervades everything Trump does regarding Ukraine, where he treats the suffering of millions as backdrop for his deal-making theater. You can hear it in how quickly he pivots from the deaths to his own accomplishments. You know, you've heard me say I settled 8 wars, some going on for 35 years, which is both likely fabricated or wildly exaggerated, and reveals the core narcissism where even discussions of historic carnage must redirect to Trump's greatness, his deal-making prowess, his belief that this war represents not a civilizational struggle, but rather a test of his negotiating skills that's proving harder than expected, because unlike his typical targets, these parties have principles beyond immediate profit. We need to sit with the implications of Trump calling this war, which has produced more than 39,000 verified civilian casualties, with over 12,000 civilian deaths since February 2022, and displaced more than 8 million Ukrainians who fled the country, and a similar number internally displaced, with more than one-third of Ukraine's population displaced by the conflict, while Russia forcibly relocated up to 1.6 million Ukrainian citizens, including 260,000 children. Something he thought would be an easier one, because implicit in that assessment is the assumption that Ukraine should have simply capitulated immediately to superior Russian force, rather than mounting the heroic resistance that has inspired the democratic world and exposed Russia's military, far less competent than its propaganda suggested. Trump's disappointment that this wasn't easier translates directly into pressure on Ukraine to accept whatever terms Putin offers, because Trump's impatience matters more than Ukrainian sovereignty, Ukrainian security, or the precedent set for every other vulnerable democracy facing authoritarian neighbors. The timing of this clip matters enormously, because Trump has insisted that Ukraine would have to cede territory, though it's unclear how this compromise would work, while the Kremlin said it wants a comprehensive peace deal, not a short-term ceasefire, and Russia wants peace, not a truce, to give Ukraine a breathing space and prepare for a continuation of the war, which reveals that Putin understands what Trump apparently does not, or chooses to ignore, which is that any ceasefire that doesn't include genuine security guarantees, accountability for Russian aggression, simply allows Russia to regroup, rearm, and attack again, when convenient, exactly as happened after 2014, when the West's tepid response to Crimea's annexation convinced Putin he could escalate with impunity. Trump's framework rewards this aggression and guaranteed future wars, because if territorial conquest through military force succeeds in Ukraine, every autocrat on earth learns that lesson and acts accordingly, from China, eyeing Taiwan, to any regional power with territorial ambitions and military capability. The progressive analysis here must emphasize that this represents the collision of Trump's transactional amorality with Putin's revanchist imperialism in ways that threaten not just Ukraine, but the entire architecture of collective security that has prevented great power war in Europe for 8 decades, and the fact that centrist proponents of appeasement argue that the alternatives, like resisting Trump's demands, would have been bad for European interests, because the United States might have abandoned Ukraine, but this ignores how this strategy serves to further strengthen far-right forces that want to see a weaker EU. Exposes how Trump's pressure campaign doesn't exist in isolation, but rather accelerates broader anti-democratic trends across the transatlantic alliance. European leaders recognize they are being tested in ways that echo the 1930s, and some are finally finding the courage to say so explicitly, which represents a remarkable diplomatic break from the usual coded language of international relations. Trump's comment that every time they take too much time, then Russia changes their mind, places responsibility for Russian intransigence on Ukrainian deliberation rather than Russian imperial ambition, which is textbook victim blaming applied to international relations, suggesting that if Ukraine would just surrender faster, Russia wouldn't have to keep killing people. And this logic is obscene because it treats Russian violence as a force of nature that must be accommodated rather than as conscious policy choices made by Putin and his regime that deserve condemnation and cost. The implied threat is that if Ukraine doesn't accept Trump's deal quickly enough, Trump will withdraw support and leave Ukraine to face Russia alone, which amounts to extortion masquerading as deal-making and demonstrates why Trump's national security strategy represents a complete break from the world America built with its allies in the wake of the Second World War, and is a slander on the bipartisan liberal internationalism based on collective security agreements among Western democracies to act as a counterweight to autocratic aggression, because you cannot claim to support sovereignty while demanding the victim of invasion surrender territory to make your life easier. This moment requires us to understand the material conditions that enable Trump's appeasement, because Trump's rapprochement with Putin and desire to end the war, quickly ignoring both European allies and Ukraine, has stirred memories of pre-World War II appeasement, with lessons about the danger of abandoning Ukraine to expansionist Russia, which would pose risks to neighboring countries and long-term security of both Europe and the United States. And these are lessons the Europeans now know they must find the will and way to apply, which suggests that Europe may have to proceed without American leadership for the first time since 1945, not because they want to, but because Trump has made transatlantic coordination impossible, when the American position involves pressuring allies to abandon their principles. The tragedy is that American leadership built the international order that has delivered unprecedented prosperity and peace, and Trump is casually dismantling it for reasons that remain opaque, but probably involve some combination of authoritarian admiration, corrupt financial entanglements, and sheer ignorance of why these institutions and principles matter. You need to feel the moral urgency of this moment, when Trump discusses 27,000 deaths in 1 month, with less emotional affect than most people bring to discussing parking tickets, because this reveals everything about the hollowness at the center of MAGA foreign policy, where strength means accommodation of strongmen, and peace means whatever Putin says it means, and American interests reduced to Trump's personal interests, which may or may not align with the national interest, depending on who owns what debts and what compromat exists. The progressive movement must articulate a foreign policy vision that centers human dignity and collective security against this immorality, because the alternative is a world where might makes right and democracies cannot count on each other, and millions of people in places like Ukraine are sacrificed on the altar of great power politics, dressed up as deal-making pragmatism. Trump's claim to have settled 8 wars demands investigation because this is almost certainly fabricated, or refers to minor diplomatic interventions that don't remotely compare to the Russia-Ukraine war in scale or significance, and the fact that he offers this boast without any specifics, while his sycophantic audience presumably nods along, demonstrates the epistemological crisis we face, where truth has become optional, and the performance of expertise substitutes for actual knowledge or accomplishment. Even if we grant for the sake of argument that Trump facilitated some minor agreements during his previous term, the Ukraine war involves fundamentally different stakes because Russia is a nuclear power engaged in the largest military operation in Europe since 1945, with implications for the entire international order, not some regional dispute that can be resolved through personal chemistry and leverage over aid packages. The comparison to World War II that Trump himself invokes, saying it's the worst since World War II, should focus our attention on what that conflict teaches about the costs of appeasement and delayed confrontation of aggression, because the lesson Europe learned at catastrophic cost is that territorial concessions to expansionist powers do not satisfy their appetites, but merely convince them that further aggression will succeed, and yet here we are 80 years later watching an American president pressure a democratic nation under invasion to cede territory to an autocratic aggressor because fighting back has become inconvenient for Trump's political timeline. Some European commentators recalled the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, in which Soviet Russia signed a non-aggression pact with Germany agreeing the two rival powers would divide up control of Eastern Europe, which freed Hitler to pivot his armies westward, and while we're not there yet, the dynamic of great powers negotiating spheres of influence over the heads of smaller nations certainly echoes that ugly history. The progressive critique must emphasize that supporting Ukraine serves not just Ukrainian interests, but the interests of every nation that wants to live in a world governed by law rather than force. Because if Russia succeeds in Ukraine through military conquest, the precedent established threatens stability everywhere, from Eastern Europe to East Asia, where China observes closely how the West responds to territorial aggression, and Trump's eagerness to hand Putin a victory communicates to Beijing that American security commitments are worthless when they become politically inconvenient, which destabilizes the entire Asia-Pacific region in ways that could produce catastrophic consequences. This isn't abstract geopolitics, but rather the basic architecture of how peace gets maintained or collapses. And Trump either doesn't understand this or doesn't care, which in practical terms amounts to the same thing. When Trump says, "I hope Ukraine moves quickly," he reveals the bankruptcy of his entire approach because genuine peace requires addressing the underlying drivers of conflict, not just freezing the current military situation in place. And Russia has demonstrated zero willingness to accept anything, short of Ukrainian capitulation, which means Trump's timeline-driven pressure campaign serves only to weaken Ukrainian bargaining position while Putin waits for Trump to deliver Ukraine on a silver platter through withdrawal of American support. After Trump offered Putin sweeping concessions which, if accepted, would have produced a terrible peace deal for Ukraine, the Russian leader only demanded more because it wasn't enough that he would be allowed to occupy 5 Ukrainian regions and keep Ukraine out of NATO, as Putin also demanded that the West stop providing weapons to Ukraine and even insisted that Zelensky be removed before Russia would negotiate, which demonstrates that appeasement breeds further demands, not gratitude or moderation, and Trump's fundamental assumption that Putin wants peace rather than victory represents either willful delusion or complicity. The callousness of polling doctors about their reaction to mass casualties speaks to Trump's desperate need for external validation and inability to process moral questions through any framework except audience response, treating 27,000 deaths as content that requires focus group testing rather than tragedy that demands justice and accountability. And this performative empathy without actual empathy pervades Trumpism, where the appearance of concern substitutes for genuine moral engagement. Progressive analysis must name this sociopathy clearly, because we cannot allow mass death to be normalized as negotiating tactics or Ukrainian suffering to be framed as Ukrainian obstinacy, when the fundamental crime remains Russian aggression that started this war and Russian choices that perpetuate it. The existential question facing the democratic world is whether we will allow Trump to midwife a new era of imperial sphere of influence politics where autocrats divide territory among themselves, while democratic publics and smaller nations watch helplessly, or whether we will insist that sovereignty matters, that aggression must be resisted, that the international order built from the ashes of history's bloodiest century retains meaning and force. Trump's Ukraine policy represents a test of whether American commitment to these principles was ever genuine or merely rhetorical cover for empire building of our own, and whether our allies can count on us when supporting them becomes costly or complicated. The answer Trump offers through the actions and his words here is that America under his leadership has no principles beyond power and no commitments beyond what serves immediate political convenience, which means every alliance becomes provisional, every security guarantee becomes suspect, and the world becomes dramatically more dangerous. We should be clear about what accepting Trump's framework means in practice, because Putin's ideal scenario would be to keep talking peace with Trump through a series of leisurely summits, while Russia continues to press forward on the battlefield, demolish Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and undermine its economy, society, and political unity, while Trump mentioned the need for a presidential election in Ukraine, thus parroting a Russian attack line on the legitimacy of President Zelensky. And this is what negotiations without leverage or principles produce, which is process that serves aggressor interests, while victim nations watch their position deteriorate. Trump's impatience for a deal, any deal, plays directly into Putin's hands, because Russia can afford to wait while grinding down Ukrainian capacity and Western resolve, but Ukraine faces immediate existential threats that require sustained support, not abandonment, dressed up as peacemaking. Progressive movement must champion an alternative vision that recognizes supporting Ukraine materially and politically serves the cause of democracy everywhere, because this is not charity but rather collective self-defense against a revanchist authoritarian power that threatens the entire post-war order. And we must make the moral case that Ukrainian lives matter, Ukrainian sovereignty matters, and the principles of international law matter, even when upholding them requires cost and risk. Trump's transactional nihilism cannot be the final word on American foreign policy, because the world that emerges from his appeasement will be dramatically less safe, less free, and less prosperous for everyone, including Americans who will discover too late that isolationism in an interconnected world means only that you choose when to engage, not whether to engage in reactive crisis management costs far more than proactive partnership. This clip should haunt us because it reveals in compressed form everything dangerous about Trump's return to power, where casualty figures become props in his narcissistic performance, and Ukrainian agency becomes an obstacle to his deal-making theater, and Russian aggression becomes just another variable to be managed rather than evil to be opposed. And if we allow this framework to prevail, we will spend the next decade confronting the catastrophic consequences of appeasing Putin at Ukraine's expense, while pretending this represented wisdom rather than cowardice. The 27,000 soldiers who died last month deserve better than Trump's casual invocation of their sacrifice in service of pressure on their own government to surrender, and the democratic world deserves leadership that understands why principles matter, why sovereignty matters, why resistance to aggression matters, even when the path forward is difficult and costly. Trump offers none of this, and we must say so clearly before he hands Putin the victory that Russian forces could not win on the battlefield, but Trump may deliver through abandonment disguised as pragmatism and the blood of those 27,000 and all who died before them, and all who will die in the wars that follow when aggression succeeds will be on our hands for failing to resist, when resistance was still possible.